The MCU is the world's biggest movie franchise, and each year it continues to add to the collection with the release of the 27th film and one of the most anticipated, Spider-Man No Way Home. It is time to update my MCU ranking and rank all 27 now that we have this new Spider-Man film. But before we get into it, please let me know what your ranking is down below. And without further ado, let's find out where Spider-Man No Way Home ranks amongst the MCU. Coming in at 27th and last place is Thor: The Dark World. This may be the worst out of all the MCU movies, which has 27 as I mentioned, but it's not a bad film, it's just very dull and boring to sit through. It doesn't really commit any unforgivable sins which immediately make it unwatchable. It's just overall not that intriguing. And to be honest, the only reasons I enjoy watching it now are because of the tie-ins it has with Avengers Endgame. In this film, the characters continue to be unlikable like they did in their first film. When you have characters you don't like and an uninteresting plot, it was always going to be one of the lower rated films. Coming in at 26th place is Iron Man 2, this being the first sequel in the MCU, and it fails to live up to its predecessor, and that all comes down to its attempts to try and set up the Avengers film really quickly. Now overall for the MCU, I think it does a good job in establishing characters before rushing into this big team-up film. This film does jump over a few aspects to try and get there, and it does dampen the quality of this film as it never really feels like the main story is actually the main story. Robert Downey Jr. continues to be great as the character, and they add in some interesting elements like the illness he gets from his arc reactor, but with a cheesy villain like Whiplash and a serious, and I mean serious, lack of action, Iron Man 2 is quite enjoyable to watch, but it does have a lot of problems. Coming in at 25th place is Thor. Now I've obviously already covered Thor: The Dark World in this list, and to be honest, this one is only a little bit more interesting and overall better. I mentioned we had dislikable characters in Thor: The Dark World, and well, they're introduced in this one. I just didn't like the whole atmosphere and tone. It just didn't feel like it offered itself well enough to an MCU film, as overall it just felt really kind of dull and boring, and it certainly drags out in long portions. But there are some good characters like Thor, obviously, but played by Chris Hemsworth, Loki, Tom Hiddleston, and Odin, Anthony Hopkins. They are the real standouts of this film. As for the human characters, they weren't that interesting, and every time they were on screen I was either bored, not interested, or getting irritated at how annoying they are. Coming in at 24th place is The Incredible Hulk. Any MCU fan who has seen this film can tell you that this is the dark sheep of this whole universe, as not only is the tone much darker than the rest of the films, but there are very few ties into other films. You have the origin of Hulk in this film, but as he's played by a different actor and the character design itself looks completely different, it doesn't actually feel like it ties into the Hulk we have nowadays. As it is that kind of outsider film, it tends to get forgotten about, or when it is talked about, it's talked about amongst the worst. And I know this is low down my list, but I think it does get more hate than it deserves. People say it's by far the worst. I don't agree. It has some really interesting things and perspectives on Hulk and how he has to keep calm. And not to mention, I think it has one of the more underrated final battles between Abomination and Hulk himself. But yes, it does have its issues, and the characters aren't that interesting, so it's hard to care about them. It really does feel like an olden day superhero film, not one that you find in the cliche MCU formula, but nonetheless, I think it's a solid film. Not the best, but definitely not the worst. Coming in at 23rd place is Black Widow. This was a film that fans had been demanding ever since the character was introduced in Iron Man 2, and they'd finally delivered that after the character had died. The character died in Endgame, and one of the first films after Endgame, they released Black Widow, a sort of origin film whilst also taking place in between Infinity War and Civil War. So instantly you kind of lose that momentum of caring about what happens to the character because you know the outcome of her. And while I did have some interesting things and perspectives, and some perspectives into the life of Natasha Romanoff, and as well as good character introductions like Florence Pugh and David Harbour, I just didn't care too much for this film, and I never felt too much emotion in it, as first of all, we already know the ending of Natasha Romanoff, and also, unfortunately, not down to the film itself, but it was delayed by over a year when it was about to come out, so I just lost the care for it at that point. And when I did watch it, even though it'd been years without an MCU film, I didn't feel like I needed to watch it. But it does have some fun. It's quite a formulaic film in the MCU, but maybe if you watch it in timeline order, you'll enjoy it more. Coming in at 22nd place is Captain Marvel. Once again, this is another film that gets more hate than it deserves, but it is certainly one of the weaker films in the universe. Brie Larson came into this film with a bit of backlash, so there were certain fans who were going to review bomb it just on her as an actress, and to be honest, her character wasn't really likable, and that was the main downfall for me with this film, because it had some really cool things with taking it back to the past, having fantastic de-aging technology for Nick Fury, as well as bringing in other old characters from the MCU at an earlier time and exploring outer space just a bit more. However, as I mentioned, Carol Danvers is not likable, so you don't care about her own little mission where she's trying to figure out who she is, but overall it gets more hate than it deserves. Not a great movie, but it still has a lot of enjoyable aspects. Coming in at 21st place is Eternals. Before No Way Home, this was the latest released, and I respect it, is what I'm going to say. I respect it for trying to do something different, and I think any person with a good amount of movie knowledge will respect it in trying to do so as well. However, it doesn't exactly stick the landing. Introducing a large cast of characters in a nearly 3-hour movie with such high stakes was always going to be tricky, and where it struggled the most is with those characters. As I mentioned, a large cast was brought in, and that is always difficult to give everyone the correct amount of development without that prior development in other films, as we've seen with the Avengers. So when it can't balance that correctly, this nearly 3-hour runtime seems so excessive. Prior to the release of this film, it was made clear that this was the worst reviewed film in the MCU, and that is way too harsh in my opinion. It's nowhere near bad. It just doesn't live up to its expectations. It expands the MCU in interesting ways, however it's just such an ambitious film and gets to its final goal with very messy execution, so it is one of the more flawed MCU films, but I wouldn't say it's one of the worst. Coming in at 20th place is Iron Man 3. Once again, this is another film which is dubbed to be one of the worst in the franchise, simply down to one twist. And while I'll admit that twist does ruin the movie's final quality, it doesn't ruin the movie as a whole. This third film follows Tony Stark dealing with his PTSD from the events of the Avengers, and also him stripped of his technology, so he has to go a bit incognito and off the radar as he's thought to be dead. It's overall a solid film, but as I mentioned, there is an infamous twist which, in hindsight, after seeing Shang-Chi, it's not as bad as we've had justice been done to the Mandarin. But here at the time, it was a very big disappointment, as that Mandarin seemed to be on course to be one of the MCU's greatest. Coming in at 19th place is Avengers Age of Ultron. While the ambitions are probably higher than the Avengers from 2012, it doesn't stick the landing and execution and delivers a messy but entertaining Avengers film. This film moves way too quickly through plot lines as it attempts to tackle many different themes, and at points it left me very confused. James Spade actually makes for quite a menacing presence as Ultron from his voice and delivery of lines. However, due to the writing, he feels underdeveloped and he could have done with some changes, so I'm hoping that he is a character that is brought back in the future. It is an underwhelming film, but it is still entertaining as we have a big large cast of characters who have great chemistry, which carries this film's quality forward. Coming in at 18th place is Ant-Man and the Wasp. Avengers Infinity War was such a huge film with massive stakes, and off the back of that, fans could have done with quite a small scale harmless film, and that's where this film came in. It was the perfect time for it as it was light-hearted and didn't have any massive stakes with the world or even universe at stake. I don't think it's as funny as its predecessor, which we'll talk about later on. It still contains all the laughs and likable characters from that film. Evangeline Lilly thrives in the field as the Wasp and adds a nice dynamic to this movie, and we continue to see that unique action between the two as they combine their shrinking tech and even enlarging tech. It's certainly a film that belongs to this place on the list, as it's not trying to be one of the best, it's trying to be light-hearted, and I think it succeeds at doing that. Coming in at 17th place is Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. Whilst continuing to expand the hilarious and lovable characters in terms of the depth and backstory, for the majority of the film's runtime, the group dynamic isn't as strong as the first, as, well, they're split up for the most of it. Rocket and Yondu do get that character development that made them more likable in this film, but as for everyone else, without them attached to the group. They're not as interesting by themselves. Dave Bautista as Drax is one of the film's standouts and provides constant comedy, as it continues to be as funny as that first film, but character dynamics aren't as strong. As I mentioned, they're all separated. So it's still a very enjoyable film, doesn't reach its predecessor's quality. Coming in at 16th place is Captain America: The First Avenger. Another film which I think gets a lot more hate for no reason at all, it seems. I think this is a very solid film, especially as an origin for the first Avenger. The only real frustrating thing about this film is that it kind of fast forwards through the main action a bit as like a montage or compilation. But other than that, I really like the world it built and where it's set in, as well as the just heartwarming story of Steve Rogers. Coming in at 15th place is Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings. As far as planned experiments of Phase 4 go, Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings can be considered a success. It takes the infamous Marvel origin story template and rips it up and delivers a great insight into martial arts and Chinese culture, topped off with some beautiful colours. Tony Leung portrays one of the MCU's strongest villains as the actual Mandarin this time. His motives are compelling, as you can see how broken he is. This film's up there with some of the franchise's best hand-to-hand combat, and it's always intriguing, but it can't escape all its MCU related issues as it enters the final battle. It relies too much on CGI when the film didn't really play out like that, and the comedy didn't really land all that much for me. At times I had some chuckles, but most of the time I didn't. So overall, this was a successful experiment, and I'm excited to see what they do with the character in the future. Coming in at 14th place is Spider-Man: Far From Home. Tom Holland's second solo outing as Spider-Man takes the character to Europe and visits some iconic European landmarks to have some great fun action in. The positives of its predecessor continue here with the humour, the great atmosphere and characters. Mysterio always seemed like a difficult villain to translate into live action, as he's a bit silly in the comics, but this film finds a way to do it, and with Jake Gyllenhaal playing him makes him one of the stronger ones in the entire franchise. Going into this, you thought it would just be a villain for that film, but it does set up the main plot for No Way Home, which we'll talk about in a bit. As this is the first film after Endgame, I like that film carries on into this one and heavily impacts it, but where this one does kind of let me down a bit is with the actual story, because it seems a bit odd that a naive Peter Parker is left with multi-million-dollar tech which has the ability to wipe out countries or cities. It's kind of annoying that these MCU Spider-Man films rely so much on technology, but overall I did have an enjoyable time watching it. Coming in at 13th place is Black Panther. This film is certainly more than a superhero film in terms of the culture it displays, and whether that is through the score, costumes, or environment and scenery, it just makes Wakanda feel like a character. While it does great things like that, and I like that many can look up to this hero nowadays from a time which hasn't had many black superhero role models. Besides that, as an MCU film, I do think it is slightly overhyped. Don't get me wrong, it is a good film and it has some great things, but out of all of them, I don't think this is the one which deserves the Oscar buzz that it got. It has a fantastic world and culture that it displays. Underneath it, it is a very generic story just shoved into this environment. And while that does work here, it just doesn't, I don't feel like it can be considered one of the best, as it's not entirely unique in that aspect. The late Chadwick Boseman plays this character very well as you see his rise up the ladder of royalty, but the real standout for me is Eric Killmonger, played by Michael B. Jordan. The climax of this film in terms of CGI was one of the MCU's worst, but I don't let that dampen my experience too much of the overall film, as it is quite an influential film for many. Coming in at 12th place is Doctor Strange, and right off the bat I'm just going to say that Doctor Strange has some of the best visuals in the franchise, not just in terms of how they're executed, but how creative they are. Like with a lot of the roles he plays, Benedict Cumberbatch nails the arrogant person who, despite his arrogance, is extremely likable and has a great screen presence. A small aspect about this film which I really like is how efficient it is with its dialogue. The script has really natural conversation which explains this whole universe to everyone in a way which doesn't feel like forced exposition. Tying in the fantastic visuals, this has one of the more memorable final battle scenes, as it's not actually a battle, it's a game of chess, if you will, or a game of chicken, as it's not about who is the strongest or who can punch the hardest. It is about wit and intellect, as Doctor Strange outsmarts Dormammu. Dormammu being a villain who was brought in right at the end, didn't get much development, but I'm sure he'll be back in future films. The main villain was Mads Mikkelsen's Caecilius, who has to go down as one of the franchise's worst, simply down to how boring, dull and forgettable he is. Perhaps controversial, but coming in at 11th place is Captain America: The Winter Soldier. As the third Avenger to get his sequel, Captain America's second film does what was unfamiliar at the time. It changes up the genre. First Avenger was a World War II story, and The Winter Soldier is more of a spy espionage action movie. This is one of the more realistic feeling films in this franchise, as although it does contain some, it doesn't rely on a big CGI battle at the end. This film is famous for its hand-to-hand combat, and it really is outstanding, as well as the fact that it mixes in those emotional ties with Steve Rogers. The Russo brothers really defined what the character is, what the character went on to do in future installments with this film as they brought him into the modern ages. Coming in at 10th place is Ant-Man. Having Ant-Man in my top 10 MCU films is perhaps my most controversial opinion of this franchise. I continue to stand by it. Like Ant-Man and the Wasp, it's not a huge scale movie, it has quite small stakes, but the mixture of comedy and the heist plot, as well as such a lovable cast led by my favourite actor Paul Rudd, just makes it such a fun and amusing film. It has a really bright flair to it, and you can tell where Edgar Wright was part of the writing team, personified through the character of Louise. I touched upon it in Ant-Man and the Wasp, but the shrinking tech allows for some really intriguing final battle scenes, whether they're cool or just straight up hilarious, like the final battle in this film. Darren Cross is one of the weaker villains in this plot. He just feels way too over the top, but it doesn't really dampen the film's overall quality. He's never going to be a villain that was going to be one of the biggest in the MCU. So I absolutely love this film, and I stick by it every time someone says it should be lower, and I may be slightly biased as Paul Rudd is my favourite actor. Coming in at 9th place is Thor: Ragnarok. Out of the big three Avengers, Thor's movies had been the weakest, as proven by my ranking. And I won't lie, expectations were low coming into this film, but Taika Waititi's style just merges so well with Thor the character, and it breathes new life into his franchise and the character. And I reckon that if this film wasn't such a success, Thor: Love and Thunder would not have been greenlit, and instead he would have been another character who would have retired or even died in Endgame. It's such a colourful, funny, and just straight up fun environment, which actually takes us into new areas of the universe, which I felt like Thor and Thor: The Dark World were very dull. As for this film, it's led by a strong female lead in Cate Blanchett, as well as improving upon that Thor and Loki dynamic, which has always been good, but here it's at its best. Coming in at 8th place is Spider-Man: Homecoming, this being the one which kick-started this MCU Spider-Man trilogy. Spider-Man: Homecoming is an unfamiliar telling of the character. There is no origin story. They just pick up where he was introduced in Civil War, and as the title suggests, we get more of him in school. Tom Holland makes for a different take on the character, as he's more energetic, naive than those who have come before him, and Michael Keaton returns to the superhero genre, this time with Marvel and this time as a villain, and in both occasions he has crushed it as the Vulture, who's surprisingly one of the best MCU villains. The combination of high school drama, comedy, action and adventure, and of course it being a Spider-Man movie makes this one of the more enjoyable ones in the franchise. Coming in at 7th place is Guardians of the Galaxy. Upon its announcement, Guardians of the Galaxy seemed like a bad idea since it was so early in the MCU, and also no one had heard of these characters. When looking into the source material, it seemed too wacky. You had a talking tree, a talking raccoon. Expectations were low, but the contagious humor was executed flawlessly by James Gunn, and the group dynamic was so enjoyable to watch as they had good chemistry despite all their differences. It's quite a heartwarming story, and not that it's bad, but it really does tell you something about the film when the plot is actually one of the weaker parts of it. Coming in at 6th place is Iron Man. The MCU kicks off with a bang. Iron Man is a carefully constructed movie, which may work because it doesn't know what is yet to come. It didn't have the tie into everything. Due to compelling characters and story played by a career-saving performance from Robert Downey Jr., you don't really notice the lack of action, but when the action is there, they are captivating. However, the MCU has seen better days when it comes to those final battles in terms of how it's executed now, in terms of how cliche it is, but that doesn't bother me too much as it's the start of a great franchise. Coming in at 5th place is the Avengers. After carefully constructing origin stories for each member, Marvel had the right to do an Avengers film and they knocked it out of the park. It all feels earned as they spend the time to develop the characters, and once they're together as a group, they develop even more to become even likable as they instantly have great chemistry. The actors were all fantastic, and special props to Mark Ruffalo, who is the outsider of this group as he's recasted Edward Norton as the Hulk and Bruce Banner. It sticks the landing in all aspects and actually devotes a large 40 minutes to its final battle, which I'm surprised has aged so well. Coming in at 4th place is Captain America Civil War. Prior to this film, people would always question, oh, what happens to superheroes with all the mess they make in trying to save the city? Well, this film addresses that in a real way. It shows they're more than people with special powers who dress up in costumes. It shows that they have consequences and an emotional side with the outcomes that happen. Separated by political views, the Avengers do split up into teams against each other. As you can understand both perspectives, you root for all characters and you don't want anyone really to get hurt. So much emotion packed into this film that is brought upon by all the other Avengers that you don't actually need a big villain. So Zemo is the perfect addition, as he's not gonna beat them in one-on-one battle, but he uses his intelligence to turn them psychologically against each other. This is a really special superhero film which shows how far the MCU has come. Coming in at 3rd place is the newly released Spider-Man No Way Home. As one of the most highly anticipated films of all time, Spider-Man No Way Home does not disappoint and lives up to all the expectations. Not only will MCU fans love it, but so will die-hard Spider-Man fans. And to be honest, it does feel more like a Spider-Man film than an MCU Spider-Man film, as it draws in all elements and characters from previous incarnations. This film is certainly a movie of two halves, where you have Pete trying to get rid of everyone's knowledge of his identity which has never been done in a Spider-Man movie before, so that element was really interesting in how it affected everyone around him as well as him. But then you have the second half, which is filled with multiverse action, characters from old films, and there's just a lot of fan service to love. While this film does rely heavily on fan service, it is all earned and satisfying. It never feels really that forced, as Peter is always the main focus, who is portrayed in such a mature way and in aspects of this film, and goes through quite a journey and shows his growth throughout all these films that he's been in the MCU. It's dark, it has great action, it is also amusing, not to mention some fantastic fan service. This was worth the wait. It's going to be really, really hard not to satisfy any MCU or Spider-Man fan. Coming in at 2nd place is Avengers Infinity War. This is perhaps the biggest superhero team-up movie of all time in terms of size and execution. For the first time, the pocket franchises inside the MCU combine, with the Guardians of the Galaxy meeting Thor, with Iron Man meeting Doctor Strange, with all of them fighting one big foe, Thanos, who is easily the best villain of this franchise, not just in terms of the scale his plan is on and how it's executed, but just him as a character. You see a personal side to him. He does care about certain people, but is ready to sacrifice them in order to get what he wants. Not only does that make him the MCU's best villain, but it also makes him one of the best villains of all time in film. You'd worry about the size of the cast and how they can do justice to everyone, but it all just works nicely, and it ended up doing what we wouldn't think it would dare to do, and kills off half of the Avengers as well as half of the universe's population, which obviously is all undone, but at the time this was such a shocking ending. But coming in at 1st place is my favourite film of all time, Avengers Endgame. I've talked about this many times on my channel, but this is such a special film to me. Following the events of Infinity War, everyone was eager to see what would happen in this film, and marketing did not show too much about what was happening in the film, and I'm grateful it didn't, because I went to see the midnight premiere of this film and it was the best cinema experience I've had of my life. As someone who's been a big MCU fan from early days, there were so many callbacks and fan service which satisfied me so much, and I understand every single detail that they're referring to. Characters either got the development they deserved in other films which they never got, or their arcs concluded in this film in an emotional yet satisfying way. It is truly a special film, as it juggles time travel as well as one of the biggest casts in movie history, which they executed with the best final battle I've ever seen in a film. I have undying amounts of love for this film, hence why it comes in at 1st place. Thank you so much for watching this video, especially if you've made it this far. Please like and subscribe, and also comment your ranking would be, or if not, you can just put your favourite MCU film. Also, let me know what you thought of No Way Home and if it lived up to expectations. Anyways, thank you for watching. Be prepared for more Spider-Man videos.